It was an unforgiving day in Cairo. The sun hung mercilessly above the city, casting an intense, unrelenting heat over everything in its path. The air shimmered, heavy with the weight of the desert. Even the ancient stones of the pyramids, standing proud for centuries, seemed to groan under the heat. The dust in the air clung to everything, making the world feel suffocating. Yet amidst this searing heat, Jack felt nothing but excitement and a relentless drive to uncover what lay buried beneath the sands. Jack was an ambitious archaeologist, always chasing the next great discovery. His career had been built on unearthing lost civilizations, uncovering secrets hidden in the soil. But this time was different. This time, he was about to embark on the discovery of a lifetime, one that could change everything. He and his team were not just digging at random spots. They were digging near the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza, an area that had long been ignored by previous archaeologists. For centuries, Egyptologists had overlooked this particular region, assuming there was nothing left to find. But Jack had heard rumors, whispers from old maps, ancient texts, and tales passed down by locals. The Lost Pyramid, a structure so ancient and powerful that it had been erased from memory. The team of archaeologists, equipped with modern tools and their vast knowledge, began their work, but they didn't have a map or clear guidance. They were guided by nothing but instinct and their belief in the existence of this lost wonder. They started by digging into the desert floor near the Great Pyramid, moving the sand and rubble bit by bit, carefully excavating the ground. The heat was unbearable, the sun relentless. But they pushed on, driven by the thrill of what might lie beneath their feet. For days they dug with purpose. Each spade of sand they moved seemed to bring them closer to something. Jack's hands were raw from gripping the shovel, and his back ached from the constant bending, but he didn't care. The thought of what they might discover spurred him on, igniting a fire within him that refused to be quenched. Then, as they reached a particular depth, something strange happened. It began with a subtle change in the atmosphere. The usual sound of the desert wind, swirling in the distance, seemed to die down for a moment, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Jack paused, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He looked around at his team. They were still working, focused on their task. But there was something in the air now, something different. And then he heard it, a whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He looked around, but no one else seemed to have noticed. The whisper wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the usual desert noises. It was a voice, low and guttural, and it seemed to come from deep within the earth, almost as if it were speaking directly to him. He stood still for a moment, trying to dismiss the idea as exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. After all, he had been working in the oppressive heat for hours, and the mind tends to wander in such conditions. But as the team continued their work, the whisper returned. This time it was clearer, louder even. Jack could hear it distinctly. "Leave," it hissed. "Leave, or you will suffer." Jack shook his head, trying to clear the sensation of unease that had started to settle in his chest. "It's just the wind," he muttered to himself, attempting to push the feeling aside. But as he turned to look at his team, he noticed that they were beginning to slow down, their movements becoming more cautious. It wasn't the heat, it was something else, something that was making them uneasy. "Did anyone else hear that?" asked Michael, one of the younger archaeologists on the team. His voice was shaky, as if he had been holding his breath. Jack looked at him, trying to read his expression. Michael's face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. "I thought I was imagining it," Jack replied, trying to keep his tone steady. "Maybe it's just the wind, or some kind of animal. The desert plays tricks on you sometimes." But Michael wasn't convinced. "No," he insisted. "It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. I heard it, Jack. It was warning us." The other members of the team stopped what they were doing, glancing at each other nervously. The whisper had become louder, unmistakable now. "Leave now or suffer the curse." Jack's stomach twisted into a knot. He tried to ignore the mounting unease creeping up his spine, but it was hard to shake off the feeling. The team exchanged uncertain glances, their previous excitement now replaced with hesitation. Jack, however, refused to acknowledge the growing dread. He knew better than to let superstition take hold of him. "Look, we're on the verge of something big here," Jack said, his voice firm, though he could feel the faintest tremor. "We've come this far. A little voice isn't going to stop me now." His words were meant to calm the team, but deep down, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The whispers felt ancient, like they were from a time far older than anything they had ever studied. He couldn't explain it, but he knew one thing for certain: this was no ordinary discovery. With newfound resolve, Jack gestured for the team to continue. He couldn't let fear take control, not when they were so close. They resumed their digging. But every time they struck the earth at a certain depth, the whispers returned. Each time they became clearer, more insistent. "Leave or die." The oppressive silence between the whispers was unbearable. The desert seemed to close in around them, its endless expanse suddenly feeling claustrophobic. The air grew thick, as though the very atmosphere was charged with some kind of energy. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the shovel, but he refused to show any sign of doubt. He had to keep going. And then, just as he had convinced himself to push forward, the ground beneath them gave way. A deep rumble shook the earth, and a part of the ground collapsed into a cavern below. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The team looked down into the newly formed hole, a black void that seemed to stretch on forever. The whispers grew louder, now unmistakable and frantic. No one should have come here. Jack's pulse quickened, but he refused to back down. This was the moment. The discovery was just beneath their feet. "We're close," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But as they peered into the hole, they noticed something. The walls surrounding the opening were etched with symbols, ancient hieroglyphs, barely visible in the dim light. They were carved into the stone, as if they had been there for thousands of years, waiting. The whispers seemed to fade for a moment, as though the tomb itself was holding its breath. Jack took a deep breath. His eyes locked on the carvings. This was it, the lost pyramid, the one that no one had ever found, the one that had been hidden for millennia. He took a step forward, but as he did, the ground beneath them shifted again. The whispers returned, but this time, they weren't just warnings. They were threats. Ancient, vengeful voices that had waited too long to be disturbed. Leave now, or face the wrath of the tomb. Jack hesitated for only a moment before making his decision. There was no turning back now. The night was unusually still. The scorching heat of the day had subsided, and now the desert lay quiet, cloaked in an eerie silence that hung heavily in the air. Jack and his team had set up camp near the base of the pyramid, hoping to get some rest after the exhausting day of digging. The flickering light of their campfire cast long shadows over the dunes, but there were no sounds, no howling winds, or the usual rustling of desert wildlife, just an overwhelming quietness that felt unnatural. Jack had spent the past few days tirelessly searching the newly discovered chamber, his excitement and curiosity pushing him past the creeping sense of dread that had been settling over him since they first unearthed the tomb. But tonight, the silence felt different. It was as if the desert itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Even the usual nighttime sounds, the chirping of insects, the occasional rustling of a scurrying creature, were absent. The air was unnaturally still, as if something was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. As Jack lay there, trying to sleep, a soft whisper suddenly cut through the silence. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, the result of fatigue and the unsettling atmosphere. But then it came again, clearer this time. His heart began to race, his eyes snapping open as the whisper seemed to come from within the ground beneath him. Jack. His name was spoken softly, but it carried a weight, a command that made his blood run cold. He sat up in his sleeping bag, straining to hear, his senses heightened. The whisper echoed again, louder now, closer. It was as if the very desert was speaking to him, reaching out from the earth itself. Jack. The voice was low, guttural, and haunting. It felt ancient, as though it had been trapped in the sand for centuries, waiting to call out to whoever dared disturb its slumber. Jack's breathing grew shallow, his mind racing. Was he hallucinating? Or was this something far more sinister? The whispering continued, now wrapping around him like a cold fog. It was no longer just in his head. It was in the air, surrounding him. The voice was unmistakable, clear as day, and yet it was still faint enough to send a chill down his spine. Leave, or suffer the curse. The words sent a shiver through his body. Jack's stomach twisted, and a knot of fear tightened in his chest. He knew it wasn't just his imagination anymore. This was real. Something or someone was warning him, warning them all. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had already gone too far, but he didn't want to believe it. The tomb they had uncovered was incredible, beyond anything he could have imagined. He couldn't back down now. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Should he wake his team and tell them what he'd heard? Should they pack up and leave the site? Or should they continue digging, pressing forward, despite the warnings? Jack's curiosity overpowered his fear. He had come this far. The lost pyramid, the chamber, the mysterious whispers. It all felt too important, too significant to abandon now. He lay back down, but sleep would not come. The whispers lingered in his mind, each repetition of the warning gnawing at his resolve. They had already made it this far, uncovering something that no one had dared to find for thousands of years. Could they really turn back now? The next morning, after a restless night spent tossing and turning, Jack gathered the team. They all looked just as weary, their faces lined with exhaustion from the sleepless night. No one spoke about the strange silence from the night before, but Jack could tell they all felt it, a creeping unease that had taken root in their hearts. The air still felt heavy, the oppressive quiet of the desert hanging over them. "All right," Jack said, his voice breaking the silence. "We need to go down and explore further. There's something under there. I can feel it." The others exchanged wary glances, but no one voiced their concerns aloud. They followed Jack to the site where they had uncovered the entrance to the hidden tomb. The hole they had unearthed had led to a small chamber deep beneath the sand. Jack had been eager to explore it further, but something had been holding him back. He wasn't sure if it was the warnings from the night before or the chilling feeling that something was watching them, waiting for them to make the wrong move. As they descended into the chamber, the air grew cooler, the temperature dropping noticeably as they moved farther from the sunlight. The walls of the chamber were covered in ancient hieroglyphs, some so worn and faded that they were almost impossible to decipher. The space was small, but it had an eerie sense of grandeur, as though it had once been a place of great importance. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of ancient stone filled the space. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual sounds of their footsteps seemed muffled, as if the tomb itself was holding its breath. Jack stepped forward, his eyes scanning the hieroglyphs with intense focus. Some of the markings depicted gods and rituals, while others seemed to tell a story of an ancient curse, one that would befall anyone who dared disturb the tomb. The curse was clear in its warning. Whoever enters this sacred place shall suffer the wrath of the Pharaoh, and their soul will be trapped within the sands forever. The words felt more real now than ever before. Jack's hand hovered over the hieroglyphs, his fingers trembling slightly. He could feel the weight of the history in the room, the presence of something far older than anything he had ever encountered. It was as if the tomb itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make the next move. He reached out, brushing his hand gently against one of the stones. In that moment, a sudden chill swept through the chamber, unlike anything he had felt before. The temperature dropped sharply, and Jack shivered, his breath coming out in a visible cloud. His hand instinctively pulled back from the stone, but as he did, he felt the ground beneath him tremble. The room seemed to shift, the walls groaning as though they were waking from a long slumber. The whispers that had tormented— No, this can't be real, Jack muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the growing sound of the whispers. The others were frozen, their eyes wide with fear as the ground shook beneath their feet. The whispers twisted and turned, coming from every direction. They were no longer just distant sounds. They were voices, ancient and vengeful, rising from the sands themselves. "Leave or face the curse," the voice hissed, sending a wave of dread through Jack's entire body. The ground trembled harder, the stone walls shaking violently, as though the tomb was alive, aware of their intrusion. Jack staggered backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers were so loud now, it felt as if the entire tomb was screaming at him. End of story. In a split second, the room grew pitch black, the torches they had lit flickering and dying as though the darkness had swallowed the light. The air grew cold, unbearably cold, and Jack felt an overwhelming sense of panic. He had never experienced anything like this in all his years of excavation. "Get out!" Jack shouted, his voice shaking as he turned to the team. But it was too late. The ground cracked open beneath them, the chamber trembling as though it were coming apart at the seams. In that moment, Jack understood the curse. It wasn't just a warning, it was a consequence for disturbing something that had been buried for centuries, something far older and more powerful than they could ever comprehend. And as the ground beneath them crumbled, Jack's last thought was a desperate hope that they could somehow escape before it was too late. The eerie silence that followed the tremors in the tomb felt suffocating. Jack's heart raced as he wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to shake off the overwhelming feeling of dread that had taken over him and his team. The whispers had stopped, but the tension in the air had only thickened. It was as though the tomb itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to make the wrong move. The walls around them seemed to pulse with a strange energy, their eyes drawn back to the ancient markings on the walls that now felt more like a warning than a discovery. Despite the ominous presence that filled the chamber, Jack refused to let fear control him. They had uncovered something that no one had ever seen before, something that could rewrite history. He had come this far. They had all come this far, and he wasn't about to let superstition stop them now. "Let's keep going," Jack said, his voice steady, though he couldn't hide the unease that crept into his tone. The rest of the team exchanged uncertain looks, their faces pale in the dim light. It was clear that they were all shaken, their confidence in their leader beginning to waver, but they followed him nonetheless. The torches they carried flickered erratically as they ventured deeper into the tomb. The walls were now covered in strange carvings and unfamiliar hieroglyphs, telling a story far darker than anything they had encountered before. The tomb seemed to have been sealed with a kind of ritualistic purpose, far different from the tombs of the pharaohs they had unearthed in the past. This place felt alive. Alive in a... With every step they took, the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, the air thick with something ancient, something unnatural. And as they pushed deeper into the tomb, they finally stumbled upon something that took their breath away. A ceremonial chamber, unlike any they had seen before. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar, intricately carved with symbols that sent a chill down Jack's spine. Surrounding the altar were strange artifacts, unlike anything found in the tombs of the pharaohs. A large black stone tablet, its surface etched with cryptic writing, lay on the altar, flanked by a golden mask and an ornate dagger, both gleaming under the dim light of their torches. The air was thick with the scent of old incense and something darker, something they couldn't name. It felt as though they had stumbled upon a hidden world, one that was never meant to be discovered. Jack stepped forward cautiously, his fingers itching to touch the artifacts. He could feel the weight of their significance, their power. These weren't just relics. They were part of something far greater, something old and terribly dangerous. "Look at this," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper as he pointed to the black stone tablet. "This is incredible. These symbols, they're not like anything we've seen before." The rest of the team gathered around the altar, examining the objects with a mixture of awe and unease. Even Michael, who had been the most enthusiastic about the dig, seemed to hesitate before reaching for the dagger. But Jack was too absorbed in the discovery to notice their discomfort. He had seen enough artifacts to know that this was something far beyond the scope of their previous work. His fingers brushed the surface of the black stone tablet, and in that instant, a gust of cold wind swept through the chamber. It was so sudden, so fierce, that it extinguished their torches in a single breath. The room was plunged into darkness. The only sound, the frantic gasps of his team as they scrambled to relight the flames. But the darkness was thick, oppressive, as if the tomb itself had swallowed the light. They fumbled in the blackness, struggling to keep calm. But the whispers had returned, only this time they were louder, more distinct. They were no longer the faint murmurs they had heard before. Now, they were clear, sharp, and filled with anger. "You've awakened him," the voice hissed. "He is watching." Jack's blood ran cold as the voice echoed through the chamber, its words vibrating in his bones. It wasn't just a warning anymore. The voice was alive. It had weight. It had power. Jack could feel it, and the air around him seemed to grow even heavier, thicker with the presence of something far beyond human comprehension. "Get those torches lit, now!" Jack barked, his voice strained with panic. His team scrambled in the darkness, the flickering flames casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. But even when the torches were relit, The light seemed weak, as though the tomb was holding the darkness at bay, refusing to let them escape. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, swirling around them like a violent storm. The walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Jack's heart pounded in his chest, each beat like the ticking of an ancient clock, counting down to some unknown disaster. "We need to get out of here," Michael said, his voice cracking with fear. "This isn't right, Jack. This place, it's cursed." Jack opened his mouth to argue, to press forward with the dig, but his words caught in his throat. There was something in the air now, something so dark, so powerful, that it silenced every logical thought in his mind. He felt a deep, gut-wrenching sensation that they were not alone, that they had awakened something far older and more malevolent than any of them could ever understand. But before Jack could speak, the ground beneath them cracked open with a deafening sound, the walls groaning as if they were alive. The chamber seemed to shift, the stone altar shaking violently, as if something beneath it was stirring. A shadow rose from the darkness below. The whispers exploded into a deafening roar, shaking the very foundations of the tomb. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and a wave of cold fear washed over them. The shadowy figure rose higher, its form taking shape in the darkness. It was tall, looming, its edges flickering in and out of existence like a mirage. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were black, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the figure fully emerged from the shadows. It was a figure draped in tattered robes, its face obscured by a golden mask, the very mask that had sat on the altar moments ago. The whispers became a roar, deafening, filling Jack's mind with the voice of the creature. "You have disturbed my rest. Now you will pay the price." The figure's hand stretched out toward them, its fingers elongated and twisted, reaching for Jack. The room seemed to close in on him, the very walls pressing inward, suffocating him. His heart raced as the ground shook beneath their feet, the tomb trembling with the awakening of whatever this creature was. The air grew thick with an unnatural cold, and Jack felt his legs go weak beneath him. The whispers were now screaming in his mind, filling every corner of his thoughts. "You have awakened the curse," the voice growled. "Now you will never leave." In that moment, Jack realized the terrible truth. They had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. The tomb, the artifacts, the curse, it was all part of something ancient, something that had waited for centuries for the wrong souls to awaken it. And now it had them. The creature's grip tightened, and Jack's vision blurred as darkness closed in. The figure before them was no longer a shadow, no longer an illusion. As the darkness of the tomb began to recede, it revealed the horrific truth: an ancient mummy, its linen wrappings tattered and worn from centuries of burial. The cold, hollow stare of its eyes seemed to burn with an eerie, unnatural light, glowing faintly in the dimness of the chamber. Jack's blood ran cold as he realized that this was no ordinary relic. This was a being of unimaginable power, a creature from a time long forgotten, but never truly gone. It was a mummy, yes, but it was something much darker, something far more dangerous. As the mummy began to move, its limbs creaking and groaning like the ancient bones they were, the air in the chamber grew thick with an unnatural chill. Jack's breath fogged in front of him, and his body seemed to grow heavy with dread. The whispers that had once been a faint, haunting murmur now erupted into a maddening, shrill scream, as if the tomb itself were alive, screaming at them for disturbing its sanctity. The sound was deafening, reverberating through Jack's skull, drowning out all other thoughts, filling his mind with a deafening terror. He tried to move, to call out to his team, but his legs felt frozen, as if the very air was holding him in place. The mummy's glowing eyes locked onto Jack, and for the briefest moment, he could feel its gaze pierce through him, as though it were looking deep inside his very soul. His heart pounded in his chest as a sense of doom gripped him. They were no longer in control. They were no longer the explorers. The tomb had claimed them. The team started to panic. Michael, the youngest and most eager of them all, was the first to react. "We need to get out of here," he shouted, his voice trembling with fear. "Now!" But as they turned toward the entrance, the way they had come in just moments before, their hearts sank. The tunnel was gone. It wasn't just blocked. It had vanished entirely. The walls had sealed, the stone doors that had once been wide open, now tightly shut. They were trapped. There was no escape. Jack! Sarah, one of the senior archaeologists, screamed as she backed into a corner, her eyes wide with terror. "What's happening? What is that thing?" Jack, his mind racing to find a solution, glanced around the chamber. But his eyes kept returning to the mummy, now standing in the center of the room, moving closer with each slow, deliberate step. It didn't move like a normal creature. It was as if it floated above the ground, its tattered wrappings shifting in a way that shouldn't have been possible for something so ancient. It moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, and Jack could feel its power growing with every passing moment. The mummy's hands reached out, its fingers long and skeletal, covered in what appeared to be a crust of centuries-old dust. They stretched toward Jack, and as they neared, an unnatural cold enveloped him. The closer the mummy came, the colder the air became, until it felt as if he were standing in a freezing, deathly frost. And without warning, the mummy's fingers touched Jack's arm. The moment its icy skin made contact with his flesh, a searing pain shot through his body, far worse than anything he had ever felt. It was as if his very bones were being ripped apart. His insides were being twisted and crushed. His vision blurred, and he gasped for breath, his chest tight and suffocating. But the pain wasn't just physical. It was as though something deep inside him was being torn away. Memories, visions, history flooding his mind at once. He saw flashes of a time long past, of a pharaoh's reign, a time when the tomb was sealed to protect an ancient secret. Betrayal, power, the curse. He saw a king, his eyes burning with greed, his throne filled with the souls of those he had betrayed. He saw the high priests, their faces twisted in rage as they sealed the curse upon the tomb. And he saw the mummy, once a man, now a vessel of wrath and vengeance, doomed to guard the tomb forever, feeding off the souls of those who dared disturb its slumber. The images came fast and furious, so vivid, so real, that Jack couldn't tell what was history and what was his own mind breaking under the weight of the curse. The mummy's vengeance had been centuries in the making, and now it had found its prey. As Jack collapsed to his knees, the sharp pain in his chest subsiding only slightly, he could hear the others screaming. But their cries were growing weaker, as if the very air in the chamber was choking them, draining the life from their bodies. Jack tried to look up, to see what was happening to his team, but his vision was spinning, his body failing him. He had no strength left to fight. One by one, his team members began to fall. Michael, Sarah, and the others, each of them crumpled to the ground, their bodies twitching and jerking as though some unseen force had taken control of them. Their eyes, once filled with fear, now glazed over, as if their souls were being drawn out of them, consumed by the curse that had awakened. The mummy's hand hovered over Michael's body, and Jack could see the shadowy figure lean in, its ancient breath cold and foul as it claimed another soul. Michael's body went limp, his eyes wide open, but his spirit lost forever, trapped within the mummy's power. Jack could barely keep his eyes open as the mummy turned its attention toward him again. It had already claimed his team, each one of them falling victim to its relentless hunger. But Jack was different. He had touched the black stone. He had awakened the curse, and now it would claim him too. He could feel his life slipping away, his body growing cold, his strength fading with each passing second. The mummy's glowing eyes locked onto Jack once more. The figure slowly reached out, its fingers curling toward him as if it were savoring the final moments of the hunt. Jack's heart raced, and panic surged through him, but he was too weak to move. The mummy had already claimed the others. Now it was his turn. Just as its icy fingers touched his skin again, the world around him seemed to freeze. The whispers, the screaming, the horrors, they all grew louder in his mind. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he felt the cold, deathly embrace of the mummy's curse closing in on him. He had disturbed something ancient, something evil, and now there was no escape. As the mummy's cold grip tightened around his soul, Jack's last thought was a desperate, broken realization. The curse was eternal. There was no way out, no salvation. They had awakened it, and now they would never leave the tomb. Their souls would remain trapped here in the dark forevermore. And as Jack's body went still, his spirit was consumed by the ancient curse. The mummy's vengeance was complete. Jack's body felt like it was made of stone. The weight of his exhaustion pressed down on him like an anchor, and his mind was clouded with the swirling chaos of fear and confusion. His vision was blurry, the flickering shadows from the dying torches making everything appear like a distorted nightmare. His muscles screamed with pain, but he refused to give in to the overwhelming urge to collapse. There was no time for that. He had to escape. The mummy was still circling him, its ragged, ancient wrappings billowing in a breeze that didn't exist. Its hollow eyes locked onto Jack with a terrifying, predatory focus. The creature moved slowly, methodically, as if savoring the terror it caused. Jack could feel the air growing colder with each passing moment, the whispers that had once been distant now growing louder, more insistent. They echoed in his mind, scratching at his thoughts, and the voice of the mummy, low and guttural, seemed to seep into his very soul.
"You are mine," the mummy whispered. "You have awakened me. Now you will serve the curse." Jack's heart pounded, each beat a loud thud in his chest. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs barely able to hold him upright. He wanted to run, but where could he go? The tomb was closing in on him, its stone walls pressing in like a vice. The whispers of the ancient curse swirled around him, growing louder and more maddening, drowning out every rational thought. The mummy moved closer, its skeletal hands reaching for him, the air around it growing even colder. Jack's mind raced. He couldn't die here, not like this. He had come so far, had uncovered something that no one else had dared to even dream about. He wasn't going to let the curse take him, not without a fight. His eyes darted around the chamber, searching for anything that might offer him a chance. And then, his gaze fell upon it, the golden mask. It sat on the altar, glimmering in the dim light, almost beckoning to him. It had been part of the artifacts they had uncovered earlier, a piece that had seemed out of place, but strangely significant. He had ignored it, focused on the other objects in the chamber. But now, it was his only hope. The whispers had stopped when his fingers brushed against the black stone, and he realized that the mask had to be the key. It wasn't just an artifact. It was a ritual object, a means to contain the spirit of the mummy, to imprison it. With a burst of energy, Jack stumbled forward, his body screaming in protest, and grabbed the mask. He felt the cool, weighty metal in his hands as he turned toward the mummy, which had stopped its advance, its glowing eyes following his every movement. Jack didn't hesitate. Without thinking twice, he lifted the mask to his face and placed it over his head. For a moment, everything stopped. The world fell silent, as if the very tomb had held its breath. The cold that had gripped the air vanished, and the whispers, the maddening, torturous whispers, ceased completely. The mummy froze in place, its hand still outstretched toward Jack, but it didn't move. The glow in its eyes dimmed, flickering like a dying flame. Jack stood there, his heart racing, his mind spinning with confusion. Had it worked? Was the curse broken? Had he managed to imprison the spirit of the mummy with the mask? He didn't know, but for the first time since he had entered the tomb, he felt a flicker of hope. The mummy had stopped. The whispers had stopped. The tomb was still. But the calm didn't last long. The ground beneath Jack's feet began to tremble. It started as a low, almost imperceptible vibration. But within seconds, the tremor grew stronger. the stones of the tomb shaking violently. The walls groaned, the ceiling cracking, and a deep, resonant roar echoed from within the very bowels of the pyramid. The stone pillars that held the chamber up creaked and shifted, as though the tomb itself were coming to life. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he realized that it wasn't over. The mask had stopped the mummy, yes, but it hadn't stopped the curse. The tomb was still alive, and the pyramid itself seemed to be rebelling against the intrusion, as if it was trying to bury them all once again. "No!" Jack shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. "This can't be happening." The walls began to crack, large fissures forming as if the pyramid were splitting open. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling, and Jack staggered backward, nearly losing his balance. His mind raced, and the only thought that ran through his head was escape. He had to get out of there. Now. The mummy's figure remained frozen, but the air in the tomb had become thick with an oppressive energy. The pyramid's groaning grew louder, and Jack could feel the very foundation of the tomb shifting beneath his feet. The mask had only delayed the inevitable. The mummy wasn't the only thing guarding this place. The tomb itself was alive, its curse intertwined with the very stones that surrounded him. Jack turned and ran. His legs were weak, his body sore, but adrenaline pushed him forward. His vision blurred, but he kept his eyes on the crumbling tunnel that led to the entrance. He had to get there. He had to escape before the tomb collapsed entirely. The ground shook again, this time so violently that Jack nearly lost his footing. He heard the deep rumble of stone grinding against stone, and for a split second, he thought the ceiling might fall in on him. He pushed forward, running faster, ignoring the pain in his body, ignoring the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. As he neared the entrance, the pyramid seemed to fight him, as though it didn't want him to leave. The stone walls closed in around him, and the tunnel began to narrow. The cracks in the stone spread, and the tomb seemed to be collapsing in on itself. The whispers returned, louder than ever, echoing through the collapsing structure, as though the curse was closing in around him. "You cannot escape," the voice hissed. "The sands of time are closing in. You belong to the tomb now." Jack pushed harder, his breath ragged, his mind focused on nothing but the narrow opening ahead of him. He reached the entrance, his hands scraping against the walls as he forced his way through. The air was thick with dust and debris, and the ground continued to shake beneath his feet. He could hear the tomb behind him crumbling, but he didn't dare look back. With one final push, Jack stumbled out of the tomb and into the bright light of the desert. The sun blazed overhead, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness of the tomb he had just escaped. But he didn't feel free. He could still hear the whispers, still feel the weight of the curse lingering in the air. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He had escaped, but at what cost? The tomb was still alive, the curse still pulsing beneath the sands. And Jack knew, with a sickening certainty, that he had not truly escaped. The mummy's vengeance would find him. The pyramid's curse would never let him go. As the wind swept through the desert, carrying with it the echoes of the tomb, Jack realized that he had only postponed the inevitable. The sands of time were closing in on him, and there would be no way to outrun them forever. Jack's legs trembled beneath him, each step forward feeling like a struggle against the crushing weight of the air around him. The path to freedom felt endless, but with every strained movement, he inched closer to the surface. His chest burned from exertion, each breath a painful gasp as he climbed the steep steps, his body covered in dust and grime from the tomb's oppressive grip. His mind was a jumbled mess of broken thoughts, images of the mummy, the curses, the whispers, all swirling together in a haze of fear and confusion. He felt as though he were trapped between two worlds, the living and the dead, both fighting to claim him. The whispers that had tormented him throughout his descent into the tomb had not faded completely. Even now, as he ascended toward the light, their echoes haunted him, swirling around him like a windless storm. They had not stopped. They were still there, and the words, those dreadful, chilling words, played on a loop in his mind. You can't escape. You belong to the tomb now. He tried to push them out of his head, to focus on the steps ahead. But each breath he took seemed to pull him deeper into the nightmare he had just escaped. The darkness, the coldness, the feeling of being trapped in a place far older than time itself. It still clung to him like a shadow, refusing to let him go. His hands scraped the rough stone of the pyramid's surface as he pulled himself upward, his body shaking with exhaustion. His fingers were raw, his muscles aching, but he forced himself to keep moving. He didn't know how much longer he could go on, but he had to. He had to escape, had to find a way out of this cursed place before it swallowed him whole. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the final step. The light from the outside world flooded his vision, blinding him momentarily, and he stepped forward, stumbling out of the pyramid's oppressive shadow and into the open desert. The sun blazed overhead, the warmth a stark contrast to the cold darkness he had just fled. For a moment, he stood there, breathing heavily, his chest heaving with relief. He had made it. He was out. The tomb was behind him. Accursed whispers fading into the distance as he collapsed onto the sands. His body hit the ground with a thud, the exhaustion of his journey finally catching up to him. His limbs felt heavy, as though the weight of everything that had happened in that cursed place had followed him to the surface. But even as Jack lay there, trying to gather his strength, the whispering began again. It wasn't as loud now, more like a faint murmur, but it was there. The sound of it sent chills down his spine, a cold, creeping dread that made him feel like he was being pulled back toward the pyramid, as though the tomb itself were still calling for him. You can't escape. You belong to the tomb now. The words echoed in his ears, and Jack gripped the sand beneath him, as though it could anchor him to the present, to the world outside the tomb. But it was no use. The whispers, once so distant, were now closer than ever, creeping into his thoughts with an unsettling familiarity. They were no longer just a voice. They were part of him now, a part that would never leave. Jack pushed himself to his knees, his hands shaking as he wiped the sweat from his brow, his body still trembling with fear and fatigue. His eyes scanned the vast, empty desert around him, the pyramids standing like silent sentinels in the distance. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the sand. But it wasn't the beauty of the desert that held his attention. It was the fact that he was no longer alone. For a fleeting moment, Jack thought he saw something in the distance, a flicker of movement just beyond the pyramids. He blinked, trying to focus, but the figure was gone, swallowed up by the horizon. Was it his mind playing tricks on him? Or had the tomb's curse followed him into the outside world? His breath quickened, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to scream, to run, to get as far away from the tomb as possible. But his body refused to cooperate. Every movement felt like it required more energy than he had left. His mind was a haze of exhaustion and terror, and the whispers, those endless, maddening whispers, were still there, still present, like a living thing that refused to let go. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him, and he fell back onto the sand, gasping for air. The hot desert wind blew around him, whipping the sand into his face, but it offered no comfort. He had survived the tomb, yes, but at what cost? His mind was shattered, his body broken, and the curse, the ancient, malevolent force that had been awakened, was still with him, still clinging to him like a second skin. And then, just as he thought he might slip into unconsciousness, he heard it again. The whisper, faint but unmistakable, like a voice rising from the depths of the tomb. "You cannot escape." Jack's eyes snapped open, his heart racing. The words seemed to pierce the very air around him, wrapping around him like an iron grip. It wasn't just a warning. It was a curse, a bond that tied him to the pyramid forever. The ground trembled beneath him, and Jack felt a sudden, overwhelming force pulling him toward the tomb. He tried to fight it, tried to push himself away, but it was like an invisible tether had latched onto him, pulling him back toward the darkness he had just escaped. He closed his eyes, gritting his teeth against the rising panic, but it was no use. The tomb was calling him. The curse was alive, and it wasn't finished with him yet. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the desert into shadows, Jack's fate was sealed. The whispers, now loud enough to fill his mind, swirled around him like a storm, filling his thoughts with dread. He had disturbed the tomb. He had broken the seal, and now there was no escape. He had thought that emerging from the depths of the pyramid would set him free, but the curse had followed him. The tomb's secrets, its darkness, were part of him now, and no matter how far he ran, no matter how fast he tried to escape, he would never be free of it. The sands of time had claimed him, and there was no going back. As the last light of the sun disappeared behind the horizon, Jack could feel the grip of the curse tighten around him, dragging him back toward the pyramid.
The whispers became deafening, the sound of the tomb itself calling out for him. And as the desert night fell, Jack knew with a sickening certainty that the horror was far from over. It had only just begun.
The tomb would never release him.